Section 10. New words for the new colors. Once alchemists created new colors, they would create new words for these colors. These words started out general and vague, then became more specific over time. As you use color words, you sharpen them. You narrow the range of hues they refer to. One example of the vagueness of early words for colors is found here. The Leyden Papyrus has a recipe titled How Asem is Diluted, a common recipe for them. It seems like just another recipe for making false gold until you look closer. First, one step says to throw upon the floating scum some blue. But what is blue? This is, as typical for alchemists across the world, maddeningly imprecise. The vague term blue suggests the unique bright pigment Egyptian blue, but we aren't sure. The translator thinks it could have been another copper salt. The specific word for Egyptian blue wasn't used. It might not have been known by the recipe writer, or it might have been kept deliberately vague as a security technique. It's actually unusual for an ancient society to have a specific word for blue and only blue. The concept blue tends to be a late invention. If you don't have the options to choose a blue paint, you don't need the adjective blue so much. You use general words like dark, shiny, or bright. This square of words shows Akkadian color words. They didn't have a word for purple or pink, but they saw these colors and they fit their existing words to fit what they saw. As shown by the arrow on top, when they saw a fully saturated dark color, whether it was blue or red, they called it semu. A very bright color like pink, they would call pesu. That's the up and down arrow on the right. Other languages had names for Egyptian blue. The Romans called it ceruleum, and the Syrians call it zaganduru. But these were more like trade names and adjectives used for the material more than the color, like pharmaceuticals or something. The Egyptians who actually made a blue material did have words for it. It was the pigment makers who became wordsmiths. There were two words for blue in the Egyptian language, which I can't say but I'll show. The one on the left, the H word, is more general, while the T word denotes the deep, vivid Egyptian blue color. We will see this pattern again in history, in the origins of the English adjectives purple and scarlet. At first, both purple and scarlet meant a particular material substance. Over time, the meaning for each evolved into an abstract color. By the way, one of C.S. Lewis's close friends, Owen Barfield, wrote whole books about this evolution and specification of language and of consciousness. If you've heard of the book Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, you should. It's one of my favorite novels of all time. That was actually inspired in part by Owen Barfield and these exact ideas. He is name-dropped in it multiple times. So back to this. As language evolves, the words shape perception too. Homer spoke of the wine dark sea, but if you ask someone today to describe the ocean, they'll probably say blue. This word evolved. The color evolved. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner thousands of years later, he would use variations of the word green. The more modern words make sense to our more modern minds, but there's great value in seeing the world the same way as the ancients did. It's a different world. The 3rd century philosopher Plotinus thought a lot about what these colors meant. To Plotinus, the act of seeing, discriminating among, and naming colors was no less than a way to get closer to God. Plotinus wrote, "No eye ever saw the sun without becoming sun-like, nor can a soul see beauty without becoming beautiful." When you see a color and dwell on it, when you give it a name, your inner light holds on to that color even when you look away. Your eye has become a window to your soul. It has colored your memory and your vocabulary. You have changed. If you contemplate a beautiful visible color, Plotinus says, your inner invisible experience becomes more beautiful. You can name this experience and describe it to others with words, or you can at least try. This inner light is gathered together by words that describe the experience of seeing that color, imperfectly and incompletely. As colors are used by more people, color words are used by more people, and in turn, people are drawn to those colors. Because colors were found, made, and used in a fairly predictable pattern, This means color words were also made and used in a fairly predictable pattern. White, black, red, and yellow typically had their own words in most languages, 83% by one estimate. But in these early languages, green and blue would share a word, like younger siblings still sharing a room even after the older siblings got their own. Phase 1 in this scheme is a word for white. Then phase 2, you develop a word for red. Phase 3, either yellow or green. And notice that blue doesn't get its own word until phase 5. Empires grew, languages grew, words were added, with green and blue still conjoined in one word for most people who weren't Egyptian alchemists or color traders. Linguists call this combined color word, green-blue, they call it grün. And in the Berlin K sequence of color naming shown above, green and blue only separate up there in stage 5, after yellow and red have already gotten their own words. Don't mishear me. If stated too strongly, the Berlin K sequence seems to represent history as an inevitable sequence of progress, and that casts aspersions on cultures that have not named certain colors yet. But I take it differently. To me, color naming is a neutral event, a beautiful thing, driven by the greed of empires and built off the toil of slaves. Ugly things are involved. The rich collect gems and name their colors. Societies lucky and rich enough to gather more colors name them more. Having more color words is not primarily an unambiguous sign of progress or societal accomplishment, but a fact of nature independent from moral judgment and independent of the moral status of the people using the names. Certain colors are easier to find and use, so the richness in words reflects a material richness shaped by luck and chemistry, and nothing more. Societies in stage 2 are just as valuable as societies in stage 5. Not to mention, words like grün might be better words if they can convey two meanings at once. So color naming is both natural and artificial. The order in which colors are named should be seen not as a consequence of human effort or intelligence, but as a gift, even a gift from God. It's an ordered, logical, sequenced event, shaped by nature, perceived by a constant faculty of the human mind, by the system of logical reasons scaffolding all things. This is what Plotinus and St. John called the logos. When enough of the world is collected or observed, a new color word splits off, increasing vocabulary but narrowing meaning. Naming colors is a good thing. When we name colors, we become co-creators of language and beauty, and the colors become part of us. The order in which we name the colors is logical, but the names themselves are historically situated and contingent. The names are our creation, describing the colors of not our creation. Both nature and mind are at play here. What's interesting is not the neutral fact that some societies got more colors first, but the meaningful fact that the diversity of language is ordered by natural factors. As this paper says, is constrained, and they're, in part, predictable. In all societies, humans use the colors at hand. Black, white, and red first, then green and yellow, then blue, in the order of the chapters of this book. They create beautiful, visible things. Those speak of the logos, of invisible truths. We all share this world, this logical sequence of color naming. In perceiving visible beauty, as Plotinus would say, we become invisibly beautiful. The simplest palette can create the most beautiful and mysterious art. I mean, just look at the cave paintings. Another advance in language happened at this time, but not with letters or words. In addition to names, we also see symbols develop at this time in these alchemical labs. The Leyden Papyrus shows a second impact of chemistry, as new colors increase the power of abstraction, adding symbols rather than words to communication and language. In the same recipe for how Asem is diluted, the words translated gold and silver aren't words at all in the original. They are symbols. This is the first time we see a symbol rather than a word used to denote an element. The other natural things that got symbols early were planets. Each planet had an element. Alchemists would develop symbols for the 7 element planet gods. which would become the two-letter abbreviations for elements that we use symbolically today in the periodic table. Part of science is putting what you found or made into words, symbols, and numbers. All these Egyptian alchemical recipes tried to express the repeatable process of making the color. So, they came up with symbols, and they end up influencing the chemical symbols that we use today in the periodic table. The original advance was chemical, but soon after followed advances both linguistic and symbolic. With instruments that can put numbers to colors, we can add quantitative data to our understanding of what color is and how to talk about it. The words came from laboratories and artisans, which used the empire's money. But the empires didn't last forever, despite their protestations to the contrary. When the empires fell, as they always will, the laboratories closed, and the flow of colors stopped. This happened 1,500 years ago when the Roman Empire fell, and techniques for the synthesis of Egyptian blue and possibly that lead antimony yellow, they were lost for centuries. Yet, other colors were preserved and even enhanced by the new social institutions and political groups that sprang up in their absence, serving as the foundation for new arts and new alchemies, and therefore new types of color across the Eurasian landmass in Central Asia, medieval Europe, and China. But that's next chapter's story to tell.